Become a sustaining member of the Commonwealth Club for just $10 a month. Join today.
Welcome to the Commonwealth Club. I'm George Hammond, Chair of the Humanities Forum, which organized tonight's event. We're having Fritjof Capra here today to speak about his book, Patterns of Connection. And I'd like to welcome all of our online audiences, both live stream and those who watch later. Today's conversation is really about his latest book. Obviously, Fritjof Capra came to prominence back in the 1970s with his first major book, The Tao of Physics. And we are going to review the intellectual history that he has taken ever since. So very happy to have you get back again. And we had a conversation back in 2014 on your book, Learning from Leonardo. And here we are again, only this time perfectly digital.
Yeah, hello, George. Very nice to see you again, even though it's just on the screen. And I look forward to our conversation.
Great. So one of the ideas in your book, we'll dive right in, is that one mindset about the world, which say comes from ancient Greece and then even more from Descartes, is that there's an absolute truth and we're trying to get it. And if we know it all, we'll know everything. Basically, there's determinism and we'd be able to predict everything. And you take a different approach, that theories are approximations of reality. So let's kind of do your journey of these different approximations of what you found important to try to understand reality. Because it seems to me what everybody who writes books about ideas anyway, everybody's trying to share their concepts about our shared reality and see if we can't converse in a way that we all get a little bit more educated about what really is going on, because it's awfully confusing.
Yeah, well, let me say, first of all, that the fact that science doesn't deal with truth, but provides us with limited and approximate theories and models describing certain natural and social phenomena, that fact, I think, is the most important discovery of 20th century science. Mm-hmm. And the reason why we can never completely describe what we experience or what we observe is that all those phenomena are intimately interconnected, so that in order to describe any part of reality completely, we would have to know how it is connected to everybody else. Mm-hmm. And so obviously this is impossible. And so what scientists do is to say, well, everything is interconnected, but some of these connections are more important than others. Mm-hmm. And I will now take into account only the most important ones, and the other ones I will leave out. And of course, which ones are the most important, is a matter of intuition, a matter of taste, a matter of careful observation. But this is why we have different theories and different models. And the progress of science consists in replacing these theories and models by more accurate ones as time goes on, but knowing that we will never get at the truth, if we mean by truth a completely accurate description of what we observe. And this has been my approach as a scientist. So, I'm often called a philosopher. I'm also an environmental educator and activist. I have done many things in my life and played many roles, but basically my approach has always been a scientific approach. At the core, I am a scientist.
You want to explain your training in this, because sometimes when people discuss those scientists who have a slightly different viewpoint on science, they often wonder how scientific they are, but you have a solid background in science.
Yes,
why don't you explain to people what it is?
I have a background in physics, and I got a PhD in theoretical physics in Vienna. I'm Austrian, and so I grew up in Austria and studied in Vienna. And from my student years, I was very influenced by a book by Werner Heisenberg, one of the founders of quantum physics. The book is now a classic. It's called Physics and Philosophy. And in this book, Heisenberg describes very vividly how a handful of physicists in the 1920s and 30s were facing a reality that was totally puzzling to them, the reality of atomic and subatomic phenomena. And it forced them to revise their basic concepts, their way of thinking, their language, to be able to describe this atomic reality. This was a huge struggle. And looking back on my student years and then on my scientific career and my career as a writer, I can say that this book by Heisenberg really determined the trajectory of my entire career.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's interesting because quantum mechanics is one of the most successful predictive models mathematically that we have. At the same time, nobody really can explain it theoretically that clearly. There are models for it, but everyone understands that there are issues with the models.
There are fundamental issues when it comes to the process of observation, to the nature of reality, and Heisenberg describes all that very vividly. And so this was one really formative event, reading this book, and I have reread it, hundreds of times. It has accompanied me throughout my life. The other formative event were the 1960s. Those were my formative years when I was in my 20s, and I embraced the various grassroots movements of the 60s, the questioning of authority, the experience of community, the whole counterculture, the strong interest in spirituality, in Eastern mysticism. And these were the years that really formed my values and my worldview. And very early on, I recognized significant parallels between the views of Eastern spiritual traditions and the views of quantum physics as described by Heisenberg in his book. And so then I put the two together, and the result in 1975 was the Tao of Physics, where I examine these parallels between the basic ideas of modern physics and the basic concepts in Eastern mysticism.
And a lot of people have followed you down that road, physicists and non-physicists. And it's interesting. Part of the issue that arises is because if we observe particles at these tiny levels, we can either know more about their velocity or know more about their position, but the more precise you get about one, the less precise about the other. But one of the issues that I think is not clear to a lot of people when they think about it from a very mystical point of view is that the act of observation is causing the issue. But our act of observation at that level is merely a mechanical process. We're not seeing it with our eyes, and we're not, we are affecting those particles by other particles that we're trying to see them with, right? As opposed to some kind of Gestalt experience that changes things.
That's right. When we observe these atomic and subatomic phenomena, we need to disturb them, because when we look when we look at things, when we shine light on something at the subatomic level, this means we direct a stream of photons toward them. And these photons, the particles of light, disturb the atom that we observe. And we can do it in various ways, and we see various things. But, you know, George, very interestingly, to make a jump now of several decades, the cognitive science of today says exactly the same thing. There's a theory called the Santiago theory of cognition, which says that the world we see is not an independently existing objective world, but it is a world that we bring forth in the process of living. So what we see depends on who we are. And we know that from experience. When you take, for example, say, I want to look at a tree. I know that a bird or an insect will see the same tree in a very different way because they have a very different sensory apparatus. So what we see depends on our sensory apparatus. And it also depends on the state of mind that we are in. You know, if I have a couple of drinks and look at the tree, I may see it quite differently. You know, even more extreme. If I were to take LSD, I might see the tree, you know, flaming and all kinds of things. And who is to say what the real tree is?
Right.
So we bring forth a world, and that began with Heisenberg and is now reflected in the most recent cognitive science.
It's interesting, like, as you said, because we also know that what we see with our eyes is a certain spectrum of radiation, you know, the colors. Right. And what we hear with our ears is another spectrum of wave motion.
Sound waves, yes.
And sound waves and so on. And so we have all these different senses, but we're not picking up all the information that's out there at all. And when you were talking about the uncertainty principle, I thought one thing that might be useful, you said about how we shine light on something. Now, there's light shining on both of us so that people can see us. But the percentage of, you know, the size of the photons compared to our size is extremely small, and there's trillions of them being used to bounce off of one big thing. We're the same size, but if I had to try to learn something about you, if I bounced myself off of you, I would not get that much information. And so by looking at these tiny particles, we are limited in even in a theoretical way, because we're going to be bouncing something off of it, which is the same size as it is, or somewhere in that range.
And you know, the great achievement of Werner Heisenberg was that he put these limitations into a mathematical framework. So we know what the limitations are, and we can operate in physics within those limitations. And in science in general, we progress by continuously improving the approximation.
What you mentioned this in your book, in one of your essays, about that limit, and it's a curiosity of mine from a lay point of view, is that the limit of uncertainty is there as if something happens within that limit, it's not real. And I was just wondering, all the talk about virtual particles and in quantum mechanics, doesn't that sort of undercut the conservation of mass energy idea, that nothing is created, nothing's destroyed, it just keeps changing form? If there can be virtual particles that come and go, but they're all right, they're not real as long as they're within the limits of uncertainty. It's an interesting combination of ideas.
It's a strange reality, but you know, the basic problem is that when you just said particles, you know, we think of little billiard balls or, you know, grains of sand or whatever, but subatomic particles are nothing like this. They are patterns of interconnections, patterns of relationships. A colleague of mine from my physics days, Henry Stapp, wrote once that for a physicist, a subatomic particle is not an object, but a set of relationships that reach out toward other things.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the shift. And in my work over these 5 decades, which I chronicle in Patterns of Connection, I came to realize that at the very core of this paradigm shift from a mechanistic view of the world to a holistic, ecological, and systemic view, at the very core is a profound change of metaphors from seeing the world as a machine to understanding it as a network.
Yes, and then we're going to go into that in detail because that's you spent a lot of your life on that idea as well. Before we do that, you mentioned about forces. This is another idea before we leave physics, I think, and move on to systems thinking. People talk about the forces, and mathematically, they're trying to unite the forces into one theory. But you mentioned that forces are just other particles at work, as you mentioned them as networks. And as if the momentum of a bunch of what we call particles around the nucleus is what keeps the nucleus tightly bound or whatever, something like that. Is what a force is. And so it's interesting that the idea of force itself as a distinction from just the momentum of particles influencing each other.
Yes.
The idea of the forces themselves.
You know, we talk about forces and we talk about the nuclear force and then the weak force of radioactive decay, and we talk about the force of gravity. But at the subatomic level, force is really not a very useful concept anymore. We have replaced it either by the concept of field, and a field, especially a quantum field, can manifest itself in the forms of particles, or without even the field idea, as networks of particles. And again, when I say particles, sets of relationships, it's all sets of relationships. But I should mention that for those of our listeners who want to go into more detail in this, I have one essay in the book called The Unification of Physics that goes into all these details from the quantum theory of the 1920s to the discovery of the Higgs boson, the latest great triumph of particle physics. That's all in this essay, The Unification of Physics.
That's right. And you just gave the point that I was going to go for, which is the idea of force is only 400 or 500 years old as an approximation of reality, and that it's not actually as useful or necessary for trying to unite those things, because there's a different way of looking at things, like as you just explained.
Yeah, I was just yesterday actually, I was talking to a friend about Newton and the law of gravity. And he asked me whether Newton invented the term gravity. And I told him, no, gravity existed before, the term existed before, but what it meant was a tendency to move toward the earth. And the opposite of gravity was levity, a tendency to move upward. Leonardo da Vinci in the 15th century used those terms, gravity and levity. What Newton did was to identify gravity as a force and gave it a mathematical expression, which is now known as Newton's law of gravity.
But he didn't come up with Newton's law of levitation.
No, he did not.
So, we will. Before we leave this totally, you talked about the 60s a little bit, and I just was wondering how you felt. This is just popular culture, but there's a new movie out of Dune, and you mentioned Dune, Frank Herbert's novel, and it certainly influenced a lot of people in the 60s. It was a sort of a capstone. So
cult science fiction.
Cult science fiction, yeah.
But I actually never read it because I don't like science fiction. It's not something that I read. But I mentioned it in my essay on the 60s because, it was extremely popular. What I read at the time was Hermann Hesse, you know, Steppenwolf and Narziss and Goldmund, and I could read them in German, of course.
Yeah.
And I read Castaneda like many other people did. So those were sort of the Bibles of the 60s.
It sounds like Siddhartha influenced you a little bit because of your interest. Where did you get your interest in the Tao and Eastern ideas? You mentioned the 60s, but is there something more specific?
You could say, you know, when George Harrison took sitar lessons from Ravi Shankar and the Beatles went to India, you know, the Indian culture was very strong and very influential in the 1960s. We had Indian statues, and I still have a statue of the dancing Shiva on my desk, you know, which actually I got this in the 70s. So this very statue has been with me, you know, in the various places where I live. And so this interest was very strong. I spent the first 2 years of my postdoctoral work in Paris in 1967 and 68. And of course, May 68 was the time of the student revolt. But in Paris, I read my first Eastern text, the Bhagavad Gita, which is often called the Bible of Hinduism, an extremely beautiful and powerful spiritual poem. And then I read books by the Beat generation, the Beat poets, Ferlinghetti and Gary Snyder and Kerouac's On the Road. And there's a lot of Zen Buddhism in those books. And I could say that actually I got interested in Eastern mysticism through the arts, through Indian music, Indian sculptures, and then through the literature of the Beat generation. And then, you know, I read scholarly books, obviously. Alan Watts was very influential, D.T. Suzuki, and various other books on these traditions.
In one of your essays, you mentioned this dancing Shiva image and your experience on a beach in California. Do you want to go into that or not?
Yeah, this is what I now call my epiphany on the beach. And so I lived in Santa Cruz, and I was doing physics teaching and research at UC Santa Cruz. And, you know, one late summer evening, I sat on one of those beaches in meditation. And that was the thing to do, you know.
Absolutely.
When you were a true hippie, you were meditating, you know, sitting cross-legged on the beach, meditating was the thing to do. And so it was a very beautiful day, very quiet. I was alone on the beach. And I felt the rhythm of the waves coming in, and I tried to harmonize my breathing in a meditative way with this rhythm of the waves. And suddenly I felt the whole environment as being engaged in a gigantic cosmic dance. And as a physicist, I knew that all the parts of my environment, the molecules and atoms, were in constant motion. I also knew that there were showers of so-called cosmic rays impinging on the atmosphere and, you know, creating, you know, showers of secondary particles. All this I knew from theories, from mathematics, from experimental data. But in that meditative moment, that experience came to life. And I sort of saw and heard this cosmic dance. And it was quite clear to me at the time that this is what the Hindus meant with Shiva Nataraja, the Lord of Dancers, Shiva representing the cosmic dance, and the dancing activity being the activity, the divine activity of creation and destruction in the universe. And that experience really gave me the impetus to write the Tao of Physics several years later. I had discovered parallels between physics and mysticism before, but that experience sort of, you know, made it visceral and emotional. and gave me a very strong impetus.
And created an image that is now in a sculpture in Europe, in Switzerland, right? Which I thought was a very nice tribute to your work.
It was, and this is an interesting story, because in the 1970s, before I published the Tao of Physics, I gave a talk about it at CERN, the European Research Institute for Particle Physics, one of the most prestigious places of physics research. And, I was a working physicist at the time, and I knew many of the people who worked there. And they listened to my talk about physics and Eastern mysticism, and they sort of smiled politely, but didn't really respond and didn't take me seriously. And then many years later, at the 50th anniversary of CERN, the government of India donated a Shiva statue to CERN, which is now in the grounds. And the administrators of CERN put up a plaque next to the Shiva statue with quotations from the Tao of Physics about the cosmic dance of subatomic particles. So I was vindicated. And in fact, I can also say that after the publication of the Tao of Physics, there were maybe 2 generations of books being published by physicists. And as I say in my essay, maybe some of those authors were even present at my lecture at CERN. Who knows?
Yeah, yes. Who knows? But in any case, very influential in an attempt to try to get this from another point of view, and also to take in another culture. So what's difficult of these cross-cultural ideas is that the images, are understood differently by different people. When you borrow an image and move it over, it seems so anthropocentric, for example, rather than the images of the dance, the molecular dance that's going on. But people, if you want to look at it, you can look at water. If you watch molecules or
of course,
motion, surrounding motion, it's the same sort of motion, just on a more a level that you can see more easily.
Yes, and of course, when we talk about the dance of Shiva, it's a metaphor,
Right.
The word dance, cosmic dance, these are all metaphors.
Right. So, but I think I'm guessing a little bit here, but I assume that experience plus your work on the Tao of Physics sort of moved you towards working on human culture, or more, human life issues.
This is another part of the story which I detail in Patterns of Connection. What happened was that the Tao of Physics was tremendously successful, much more than I had ever hoped for. And so I was invited to give lectures and seminars to professional organizations, to architects and health professionals and psychologists and anthropologists, people from all walks of life. And very often after these lectures, people told me that a similar change of paradigms was happening not only in physics, but also in their fields, in biology, in medicine, in forestry, in anthropology, and so on. And so I became interested in these other areas. And at a certain point, and so I expanded my focus and did more research in other areas. And at some point, I realized that the issues I now was interested in, like health or politics, economics, the management of organizations, political power, and so on. And of course, my roots in the 60s had prepared me for that, the counterculture of the 60s that questioned authority and so on. So anyway, I realized that all these issues had to do with life, with human beings, individual organisms, ecosystems, social systems. So, and physics, I knew, had nothing to say about life. The nature of life is not something that is discussed in physics. And so I had to go beyond physics and look for a new framework. And this was the beginning of a long journey of 30 or 40 years to put together what I now call the systems view of life, a synthesis of a new understanding of life in terms of relationships and networks.
And you had a predecessor in Erwin Schrödinger who wrote a book, What is Life, as a physicist. Why don't you explain that to people too? Because that's, a lot of scientists are not willing to step outside their area.
Absolutely.
And say anything.
I think Schrödinger is one of the very underestimated scientists. He's, of course, famous for his Schrödinger equation in quantum physics, but he also, was very interested in the nature of life. And this small book, based on lectures he gave in Dublin, this book, What is Life, really has two aspects. One is that he said, living systems need a continual flow of energy and matter to stay alive. Mm-hmm. They are always far from equilibrium. They do not observe the second law of thermodynamics, which says things go from order to disorder. But there is an opposite movement from disorder to order, and that remained a big puzzle for many decades. Mm-hmm. And the other thing that Schrödinger did in his book was to say that there must be physical units of heredity, which, mm-hmm. Darwin and Mendel did not know, or they did not really address the question of the physical nature of the units of heredity. And Schrödinger said there must be a molecular structure. And this sparked the whole movement of molecular biology, which culminated in the discovery of the double helix structure of DNA, the genetic code, and all that. So Schrödinger was tremendously successful. And she did many other things. He had a theory of color vision and all kinds of sciences. And I'm sorry to say that I missed meeting Schrödinger. He was teaching at the University of Vienna, maybe 10 years or so before I became a student there.
Well, you can be forgiven that being 10 years old at the time. But it's an interesting thing. And I, since I like cross-discipline thinking and ideas, I really like the idea of scientists who are very good in their field that then step outside it and say, this is where some of what we're thinking about might influence you. You're talking about it from your book, The Tao of Physics, and how the same sort of movement away from absolutist ideas was happening in all these other fields. That's what got you interested from your speaking.
And you know what I tell young people, students and other young people, when they ask me about what they should study and what career they should take, and I tell them, get competent and acquire skills in a particular discipline. And it doesn't matter what the discipline is, because you're not going to have a life where you will have the same profession throughout your life. Mm-hmm. Our world is quite different now. We don't have stable jobs during our whole life. We don't even have stable professions. But what you will keep is to learn how to think critically, to address a problem, to organize your thoughts, to organize your work. All that you learn if you get training in a particular discipline, and that can be transferred to other disciplines.
It's great advice, because it's, as you said, that's our new world. We're in the transition group between those two worlds, but everyone coming out of college now probably have 4 or 5 professions before they're finished.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah. And it's a good reason why liberal arts is still useful, etc.
Yes.
You can, how to express yourself, how to make it clear, because so many, you make this comment in one of your essays too, our emotional needs get in the way of our clear thinking. That's sort of what gets in our way. And so really one has to kind of get around that if we can.
At the same time, we need to recognize that there is an overall global narrative, the narrative of Gaia, our living planet, which needs to be respected. So whatever we do in life, in whatever profession, we need to do it in such a way that we do not interfere with nature's inherent ability to sustain life and to continually regenerate life. So that's a very important, moral constraint and a moral responsibility that we have.
Yeah, you talk about dissipative structures, if I've got the word right, right. Which are structures, and you use the example of something that wasn't life, which was a whirlpool. A whirlpool can last for quite a while as a structure, and other material is going through it. A river, I mean, not too much different, but the material keeps going through it, but the structure stays the same. And it reminded me from a legal point of view of tax structures that are set up so that all the information just flows through it and nobody gets taxed. But
yeah, well, this is characteristic of all life. It's easier to look at the whirlpool because we have experience of that, but a living cell metaphorically can be understood as a whirlpool. Energy and matter go through it all the time, but the network of relationship that exists, that are the very essence of the cell, remains the same. So what it means is that life is inherently regenerative. It organizes itself in networks, and the very essence of the organization is the continuous regeneration.
And we know from science that our cells only last 6 or 7 or 8 years or something like that, and they're replaced.
That's right.
Other parts of it, the same thing. If we go down to the level of the atoms, it's probably even more. And I think this is one of the things that really fools us about life, because we have visual memories of everything. So we imagine, for example, if you think about your childhood, you imagine your house still being there, that you could visit that physical house. Now the house itself might be there, but what it's made out of is completely different by now. Yeah. So and this idea of networks, we have a continuum. We're always in this continuum. One of the ideas that has been come up often for millennium is that there might be that there's a particle of time, like there's a particle of reality, like the atomic theory. But there's a particle of time, that is, there's some piece of time that is the smallest amount of time that one can have. But that idea would require that the whole universe is recreated every time that instant comes along. Whereas the idea of a continuum completely eliminates that idea. It's just everything is in the current present. So we have a lot of questions coming in already, but I want you to cover some of your big ideas about systems thinking before we get to the questions. So.
Okay, well, I can do it very quickly by saying that if the world is really a network or networks within networks, then in order to understand it, we have to learn how to think in terms of networks. And as everybody knows, a network is a certain pattern of links, of relationships. So we need to think in terms of patterns, in terms of relationships, and in terms of context. And that's what is called systems thinking or systemic thinking.
That was very short. So, and you explain in your book how that's more popular in different areas now, and how important it is. Like in economics, there's this theory of the rational man, making decisions on this, and there's no real person who behaves the way that the theory is based upon.
That's right. I mean, economics has to be really restructured very, very fundamentally. And what we have now is, well, let me go back to the past. In the early economists were looking at how the exchange of goods and the buying and selling using money as the tool, how this can contribute to our wealth and our well-being. And from money as a tool for buying and selling, over the years and over the decades, money became a purpose in itself. To make money became a purpose in itself. And what happens when you make money in an unlimited way is that at first, you use it for your livelihood, food and shelter and everything. Then when you get very rich, you buy villas and yachts and all kinds of trappings of wealth. But then you reach a certain point where you have everything. You can't buy anything, but you still accumulate money. And our billionaires today use money as a measure of power. That's what it has become. One of these early on, a petroleum tycoon by the name of Hunt, I forgot his initials, very famously said, money is just a way of keeping score.
That's right.
So it's to see who has more power, Is it Elon Musk, or is it Jeff Bezos, or is it Richard Branson? All these people now fly into outer space to show how much money they have. In other words, who is the most powerful? And at this point, money, of course, not necessarily makes you happy, because when one billionaire realizes that his competitor has a few billion more, then he becomes an alcoholic and gets very depressed. I mean, with all this wealth. So we need to really put the financial sector of the economy in its place, so that the purpose of economics is to further our well-being and to further the constant regeneration of our natural environment, and not use it as a measure of power.
And it's interesting because when you measure things for the wrong reason, as you said, it becomes the goal. And it reminds me of IQ testing. You can't really measure someone's intelligence overall, but you can measure their academic things.
Yeah, at the very center, and I write about this a lot in the book, at the very center of our interconnected global problems is this illusion that unlimited economic growth, purely quantitative growth, is feasible on a finite planet. So we urgently need to shift from quantitative to qualitative growth, because in nature, not everything grows all the time. Certain parts grow, others decline, and then disintegrate, release their components that become resources for new growth. And this kind of balanced, multifaceted growth is very well known to biologists and ecologists, and I call it qualitative growth, growth that enhances the quality of life.
And I think you point out, if you just measure our success financially by the GDP, you could do anything. You could destroy everything. Like the GDP goes up if a hurricane destroys everything and you have to rebuild it all. Well,
absolutely.
And so it's a very inaccurate measure of what's going on, and it will be particularly problematic if we attempt to bring the population down as opposed to up.
I mean, the GDP is a very crude, purely quantitative measure, and there's a big difference between quantities and qualities. Quantities can be measured. Qualities need to be mapped. Something like health or happiness or beauty cannot be measured on a quantitative scale. They have to be mapped. And so what we need now to judge the health of the economy is qualitative indicators of health, education, literacy, and so on. And of course, there are movements that do that. There's a European organization beyond GDP, for example, that pursues that.
Yeah, I think you point out there the difference between quantitative details and mapping, measuring and mapping. And you do that in your essays too. And I think that that's part of the movement. But it's very interesting to me because I think that one of the 20th century myths for science was if you can't measure it, you can't know it. Well,
right.
Well, you know, we have so many things that we know that we cannot measure in that quantitative way. And certainly we don't want to reduce our life to just those quantitative things. The success at quantitative measuring, though, is absolutely a valuable part of making a higher qualitative life. So it's not that one or the other is wrong. So
no, I think in systems thinking, you know, there's a shift from the parts to the whole, but we don't forget about the parts. We also deal with the parts.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have some questions that have come in, and I'll ask them. Gary asks, you use the word divine in describing the interconnectedness of all things. What do you mean by this?
Well, I use the word divine when I talk about spiritual traditions. And in my own work, actually, I don't use it much, if at all. But in spiritual traditions, the essence of the universe, or, you know, the aliveness, the spirit of the universe is often associated with the divine. And in Hinduism, for instance, you have a whole series of gods and goddesses. In monotheistic religions like Islam, Christianity, you have a single God. And there are other spiritual traditions like Buddhism and Taoism where the divine is not used. There is no divine entity. So I use it to refer to these traditions that use the term.
Okay, good. And David Brown asks, is our universe expanding and is gravitational energy conserved? A couple of physics questions.
Well, this is an area that I'm actually not an expert on, the area of cosmology and astrophysics, which involves Einstein's general theory of relativity. And from my conversations with astrophysicists and cosmologists, I have learned that these terms like conservation of energy do not apply when you talk about the universe as a whole. And I'm glad that we're coming toward the end of our conversation, because if you asked me to explain this in more detail, I couldn't. This is not an area of my expertise. But I can recommend a fabulous book, a small book by an astrophysicist, a young woman called Jana Levy. And the book is How the Universe Got Its Spots. And she talks about all these things in the book.
Right. We had, I don't know if you know Sabine Hossenfelder.
No.
She's a German physicist. We had her on a couple of months ago, and she was great about the big issues too. She works out of the Frankfurt Institute.
I see.
Lua Koenig asks, what do you think this convergence between such a vastly distant area of thought means about the nature of reality, the convergence of different fields? Do you think that that means the fact that all these disciplines are converging towards system thought? What does that mean about reality?
Well, I think what it means is, as I said before, that there is not there's no independently existing reality. We bring forth reality in the process of living. And if we bring forth very similar views of reality, that means to me that we are really coming close to the very essence of human nature, which we all have in common. So whether we are from the East or the West or North and South, we are all human beings and we experience nature in a certain way. And for instance, take Native American cultures who talk about nature as all my relations. Well, that's systemic thinking. They are systemic thinkers. And so when we come to the very essence of human nature, it's our sense of being interconnected, of being part of one larger whole, which is both ancient wisdom and modern science.
That comes right to the next question, which is really a good one. Now, you've obviously delved into a large number of different theories and philosophies and religions over the years. Something, as you say, the 60s influenced a lot of us to do exactly the same thing. This question comes from Arum, and he asks, what area of Eastern philosophy do you find the most intriguing at this point in your career in life? Is there one in particular, or is it just the general systems thinking of several of them?
I have, studied and experienced the three major traditions, Hinduism, Buddhism, and Taoism. And I wrote the Tao of Physics before I ever went to India. And, gained my knowledge from books and conversations with teachers and so on. And when I went to India, I realized that I could never be a Hindu because this is so culturally specific, and it's not my culture. The practice of Hinduism is not my culture, whereas Buddhism has transcended cultural trappings, has moved from India to China to Japan to North America and Europe, and I can be a Buddhist. So I have been close to Buddhism for most of my life, but I'm also especially fascinated by Taoism. This is why I called my book The Tao of Physics. And my meditative practice is actually a Taoist practice. I have practiced Tai Chi for many decades, and that's my spiritual practice.
Perfect answer. Now we have a couple of questions on video. So if we can roll one of those, that'd be just great.
That's great.
Hello, I'm Elizabeth Carney, and I have a question for the Commonwealth Club program, Patterns of Connection. Given that COVID has shined a light on our broken systems in our country and in our world, I'm wondering what your thoughts are about how we can respond to the breakdown with the medical system. What you see, how we could create a new system, a new paradigm, and what actions we could take. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth, for this very topical and very important question. Well, first of all, I can tell you I have an essay in the book about the COVID pandemic. It's chronologically the last essay I wrote just last year. And I say in it that I see the coronavirus as a biological response of Gaia, our living planet, to the ecological and social emergency that humanity has brought upon itself. And I elaborate on that. I don't talk about the medical system in this book, but I do talk about it in my book, in my textbook, The Systems View of Life, because the systems view of life corresponds to a systems view of health that deals with health in terms of relationships and networks and fluctuations and so on. And I should mention here that I also teach an online course based on the textbook about the systems view of life. The course is known as Capra Course, easy to find on the internet. And I've taught it for 6 years now. And in the course, I have a specific lecture about the systems view of health, where I go into these details.
Great. One of the things that you mentioned in the book is about the carrying capacity. This is often raised, the carrying capacity of the earth. And one of the things when I was looking at that myself a couple of years ago was something we talked about just before this conversation started, which was about fungi. That fungi are 2% of the biomass of the earth. And human beings are 1/10,000th of 1% of the biomass of the earth. So if we took, if we replaced half of the fungi with human beings, the carrying capacity, we would still only have 1% of the biomass on earth. And I calculated that as being 100 trillion human beings. So I assume that we obviously can't do that, but it doesn't seem it's the biomass carrying capacity of the earth. It's how intelligently human beings go about living their life and whether they're poisoning the system and so on and so forth, as opposed to the actual biomass that we need to keep living. I was wondering if you wanted to comment about that.
What it means that we, rather than dominating nature, which is part of the 17th century mechanistic worldview, Descartes, Francis Bacon, and so on, rather than dominating nature, we need to cooperate with nature. We need to be part of the community of life. And when you are part of a community, then you behave in a certain way to show that you're part of the community. And that's the very essence of the idea of ecological sustainability, to respect and cooperate with nature's inherent ability to sustain life. That's our challenge.
You talk in your book and in a couple of your essays about shallow ecology and deep ecology. And shallow is just thinking about it from a human point of view, and deep is to think about it from the entire, the whole biological system on our planet, of which we are only 1/10,000th of 1% of.
That's right. That terminology was created by a Norwegian philosopher, Arne Næss, in the 1970s. And it was elaborated on in great detail in the Earth Charter, published first in the year 2000, which is a set of 16 ethical principles that show us how to create a world that is sustainable, just, and peaceful. I have a whole essay about the Earth Charter also in the book.
You have to go back to the question about divine before. These ethical principles are merely observing the way life is and commenting on it, and they're not dictated by some divine.
Yes, and in particular, from a science point of view, ethics means behavior for the common good. You see, when life emerged on the planet 3 billion years ago, life immediately formed communities. The first bacteria formed bacterial colonies, and at all levels of evolution, life has flourished in communities. And it turns out that those communities in which the individuals acted for the benefit of the whole, for the common good, had an evolutionary advantage. And those are the ones we see around us now. So from a science point of view, ethics means behavior for the common good.
And we have another video question. If that could be brought up, that'd be great.
Hi, Fridtjof. Thank you for doing this talk. And my name is Manuel Manga, and I would like to ask you one and related question. My main question is, how do we transition from a global capitalist system toward a more sustainable and ecological civilization? And related to that, what kind of leadership and actions are needed? Thank you so much for your work.
Well, this is a big question. Thank you, Manuel. And I would say the first step means to recognize the faults of the capitalist system we have now, in particular to recognize the fallacy of this obsession with unlimited growth, the illusion that this is possible on a finite planet, and the shift from quantitative to qualitative growth. The other thing I would say is we need to recognize that all the major problems we have today are interconnected. They are systemic problems, and they need corresponding systemic solutions, which means solutions that do not address any problem in isolation, but always in relationship to other problems. And in my textbook, The Systems View of Life, my co-author and I spent 60 pages analyzing the most important systemic solutions that exist today. And we conclude that we have the knowledge and we have the technologies to move toward sustainability. What we need is political will and leadership. And this leadership will probably not come from the top, but has to be exerted by all of us, has to be widely distributed.
I think of often it's that we're moving towards a democratic future, but we're still completely dripping in authoritarian ways. You know, I mean, we haven't been convinced yet, even in our personal lives sometimes, not to just demand that the world adjust to us rather than us adjust to the world and do it intelligently.
Absolutely, yes.
So we have another question here, and then I have one last thing before we wrap it up. So Susan Hopp asks, you speak about respecting the earth and its ability to regenerate life. In the time of the Anthropocene, do you believe the human race can shift away from the lack of respect in our actions? Well, you just said that you think so, but why don't you say a little bit more about that? Can we do it?
This question is very often asked, and I actually end my book with this question. Is there hope for the future? And the greatest inspiration I have found during the last 20 years comes from the great Czech playwright and statesman Václav Havel, who turns the question into a meditation on hope. And I just want to briefly read you what Havel says. That's on the very last page of the book. The kind of hope that I often think about, I understand above all as a state of mind, not the state of the world. Either we have hope within us or we don't. It is a dimension of the soul, and it's not essentially dependent on some particular observation of the world or estimate of the situation. Hope is not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something makes sense, regardless of how it will turn out. So that has inspired my whole work.
And that was where I wanted to end this program, because it's a great quote. And I just, when we look at that kind of comment, we should have hope that there's some certainty out there, because there are patterns. There are patterns in our personal behavior. There's patterns that we're figuring out in the matter. We just need to keep this project going further and further. We maybe understand 3% of what's going on in our bodies, or 5% of something else. And I think if we just understand that there is a certainty, there's too many patterns for it to just be whimsical and chaos. That if we're intelligent and work together and we get a lot of diverse views, so that we can gain the advantage of having millions of us instead of the disadvantage of it, we should be able in just 4 or 5 centuries figure that out.
Yeah, and there is a great order in the universe, and in modern science, even chaos theory says that chaos is not what we think it is. It's a hidden form of order. So we are in a great symphony of life, or in other words, we are part of the community of life.
And Pythagoras, who got a lot of scientific thinking going, was the one who said, this is not chaos, this is cosmos, it's an order.
Right, absolutely.
So we'll end it there, and so ends another event at the Commonwealth Club in its 119th year of enlightened discussion. Thank you very much for joining us, and Fritjof, thanks again for joining us once again.
Thank you, George. This
was
been
too long. We'll do this again.
Very, very, very beautiful. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much for joining us.